Gemini, God will help you recover what you lost. Trust in the restoration. There are moments in life when even the brightest souls lose their sparkle. Not because they're broken, but because something precious has quietly slipped away. Trust, hope, love, or even the sense of who they used to be. And while your mind may race ahead, making plans and weaving logic to stay afloat, your heart, dear Gemini, has felt the quiet ache of absence. You've carried this loss like a folded letter in your pocket, hidden but always close. Perhaps you told yourself you moved on. Perhaps you laughed louder, worked harder, or distracted yourself with curiosity and ideas. But deep within, a part of you has been waiting for something to return, something only the divine can restore. Today, I want to share something sacred with you, something that doesn't come wrapped in prediction, but in divine truth. What was lost is coming back to you, not in the same shape it left, but in a form more luminous, more whole, and more aligned with who you are now. If you found this message, it isn't by accident. Your soul called it forth. And I invite you to stay with me, to breathe deeply, and to receive this message not with your clever mind, but with your tender, intuitive heart. If this resonates, I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe, not just to stay connected, but to anchor this energy in your life and offer to someone else who might be silently waiting too. Let's begin. Gate 1. The hidden weight of loss that Gemini tries to rationalize. Gemini, of all the signs, you are the dance of thought, the messenger between realms, the one who weaves meaning out of contradiction. Your brilliance is in your adaptability, how you shift between personas, stories, and understandings, always seeking the deeper thread. But what happens when the thread breaks? When something is taken from you, not suddenly, but slowly, subtly, so quietly that not even your quicksilver mind notices the void until it begins to echo. Loss doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it tiptoes in while you're busy being strong for others or entertaining distractions to avoid stillness. You might have lost your trust after someone close betrayed your confidence. You might have lost your belief in timing after opportunities you longed for slipped through your fingers. Or perhaps the loss was more internal, your sense of innocence, wonder, or the lightness that used to define you. Because Gemini is ruled by Mercury, the planet of communication and intellect, you often attempt to make sense of pain rather than fully feel it. You tell yourself stories that make loss more palatable. Maybe it wasn't meant for me. Maybe I'm being protected. Maybe I'll find something better. And while there is truth in those narratives, there's also grief that gets bypassed. Let me share a story with you. Mira was a Gemini woman in her late 30s. She had always been the life of the party, brilliant in conversation, witty, able to hold a room's attention with ease. But beneath the sparkle was a silent ache. She had once loved someone deeply, a man she believed understood her contradictions. But that relationship ended in confusion, without closure. He vanished not with cruelty, but with absence. No goodbye, no explanation. Over the years, she explained it away to others and even to herself. He probably wasn't ready. It's okay. I moved on. But she hadn't. What she had done was bury the loss under layers of activity and intellectual processing. She avoided silence because in silence, the echo of his absence grew louder. It wasn't until she began her healing journey, years later through journaling and therapy, that she finally admitted what she had truly lost. It wasn't just him. It was a version of herself that had once believed she could be fully known and held. Gemini, this is where many of you find yourselves, carrying invisible grief while convincing yourself that you're fine, smiling through situations where your inner child is quietly asking, will I ever feel safe enough to love like that again? The divine sees this internal conflict. The angels assigned to you have witnessed every moment you try to laugh through pain, every time you downplayed what broke you, every night your thoughts spiraled in silent rooms. And now, something beautiful is unfolding. God is not asking you to relive the pain. He is inviting you to finally see it, to stop running from the shadows and turn toward them gently, lovingly, because once you acknowledge what was truly lost, you create the sacred space for restoration, not a replication of the past, but a divine return to what that experience symbolized. Trust, connection, passion, purpose. What was taken from you was not taken in vain. You are not being punished for being vulnerable or for dreaming too boldly. You are being prepared for something deeper. It is in your very duality, Gemini, that your gift lies. You are both the skeptic and the believer. And now, you are being called to shift into belief. Not because you have all the answers, but because you've reached the point where surrender is the only truth left. And it is there, in the surrender, that God will move. You might notice signs soon. Dreams that feel unusually vivid, a song on the radio that stirs a memory, a stranger's words that feel too specific to be coincidence. These are not illusions. These are whispers from the divine, confirmations that your restoration has begun, not by force, but by grace. And just like Mira, you may one day wake up with tears streaming down your face, not because you're hurting, but because finally you feel seen. Because finally what you lost is finding its way home. Not the person, not the opportunity, but the part of you that was locked away in grief. You don't have to pretend anymore, Gemini. You don't have to carry it alone. God has already been working behind the scenes. What's coming isn't just a return, it's a reawakening. Are you ready to open the door? Gate 2, why Gemini's restoration, begins with inner permission. Gemini, your mind is a symphony of possibilities, ever weaving, ever reaching, ever reframing. You can analyze your way out of almost anything, and your curiosity is a gift that leads you toward new worlds. But when it comes to healing, sometimes you need more than insight. You need permission. Permission not from the world, not even from the person who hurt you, but from yourself. You see, for many Geminis, a delay in restoration isn't divine hesitance. It's internal hesitation, a voice that whispers, I shouldn't need this anymore, or I've already survived without it, so why revisit it? You pride yourself on strength, on movement, on finding light even in the shadow. But healing doesn't ask you to abandon that. It simply asks for honesty. Are you truly whole? Or have you just learned how to function with a missing piece? Let me share with you the story of Thomas, a Gemini in his mid-40s, who built a remarkable career as a strategist in a fast-paced tech company. To everyone else, he was charming, witty, and always ahead of the curve. But inside, he carried a quiet heartbreak, the loss of his relationship with his father, a man who never saw him, never understood the way his mind moved, never celebrated his gifts. They hadn't spoken in over a decade. Thomas had long told himself it didn't matter. He'd created his own family of friends, his own success, his own path. But at night, when he lay in bed, that narrative began to crack. Not because he longed for man himself, but because he still carried the unspoken belief that he was unworthy of being truly known and accepted. One afternoon, while reviewing data reports, he came across a phrase in a book lying on a colleague's desk. You cannot move forward freely if the past still owns your definition. That moment shifted something. It was as if a veil lifted, and he saw that his drive to succeed was partially a mask, an attempt to outrun the belief that he had to earn love. Thomas didn't call his father. He didn't need to. What he did instead was sit with a part of himself that still craved approval. And for the first time, he gave it, not with words, but with presence, with understanding, with permission to grieve what never was. Gemini, restoration for you begins in a similar way, not with grand gestures or lightning bolt miracles, but with an intimate moment of self-recognition, with the question, am I allowed to want this again? Whether it's a return of trust, love, joy, safety, or even your voice, only you can open the door to let it back in. The divine is already at work, Gemini, but God will never force his way in. He waits for your yes. And not just the surface level yes, but the one that comes from the depths, the yes that says, even though I've learned to live without it, I choose to open my heart again. This is not weakness. It is sacred bravery. And I know there's a part of you that worries. What if I open my heart and it gets broken again? What if I let hope rise and it falls harder than before? These are valid fears. But remember, this time you're not the same. You've grown. You've learned. You've discovered the strength of your own light. The restoration that is coming is not a repeat of what was lost. It is a divine recreation. God does not hand back what you lost in its former form. He transforms it, he expands it, and he shapes it in alignment with who you become not who you once were. In the days ahead, begin to notice what your soul is nudging you toward. Perhaps you'll feel drawn to revisit an old passion or to reconnect with someone from your past. Perhaps you'll hear a phrase that lands deeper than it should. Or perhaps you'll simply wake up with a quiet knowing that something has shifted. These are not coincidences. They are the early whispers of your restoration. But for restoration to take root, Gemini, you must give yourself permission to feel, to need, to hope again. If you buried your dreams under practicality, now is the time to unearth them. If you silence your heart to protect yourself from pain, now is the time to listen again. If you labeled your longings as naive, now is the time to call them holy. You are not being foolish for believing in more. You are being faithful. Faithful to the version of you that still lives beneath the masks and mental mazes. The version of you that always knew you were worthy of wholeness. And when you finally say yes, not just in thought, but in energy, the divine responds. The timing unlocks. The pieces shift. The people come. Not because you forced it, but because your soul aligned with the readiness of heaven. So I ask you, Gemini, are you ready to receive not just what was lost, but what has been waiting all along? Gate 3, when the mind stops fighting and the heart begins to heal. Gemini, you've always been a sign of duality, not in contradiction, but in coexistence. The thinker and the feeler, the seeker and the skeptic, the wanderer and the one who longs come home. You've lived much of your life navigating polarities, shifting between what your mind can solve and what your heart refuses to let go of. But there comes a time, quiet and sacred, when all that intellectual movement pauses. Not because it fails you, but because the answers you truly seek are no longer in the mind. They are in the healing of the heart. This is the third threshold of your restoration. And it is the hardest to cross, not because you lack courage, but because you've been trained, perhaps unconsciously, to believe that feeling too deeply is a risk. When emotions grow intense, your first instinct is often to retreat into understanding. You try to categorize your wounds. What caused this? How do I fix it? What did it mean? But Gemini, some things are not meant to be understood. They are meant to be felt, completely, unapologetically, without being analyzed into smaller, safer fragments. Let me tell you about Amaya, a Gemini who had been through years of emotional upheaval. Her mother had passed away just as her marriage was crumbling. She kept telling herself she needed to stay strong for her children. She became the organizer, the planner, the fixer. Her home was in order. Her calendar was full. But inside, she was a hollow fortress. Every time she felt grief rise in her chest, she cleaned the kitchen. Every time loneliness whispered through her evenings, she'd open a new book. Every time someone asked, "Are you okay?" she'd smile and say, "I'm managing." It wasn't until her son asked one night, "Mom, do you still miss Grandma?" that the wall cracked. She replied, "Of course." But this time, she didn't hold back the tears. She sat on the floor and cried, not just for her mother, but for the years she spent trying to hold everything together while silently unraveling inside. It was messy, it was raw, and it was sacred. That moment changed everything. Gemini, your restoration cannot happen through logic alone. The mind is a magnificent ally, but the heart must be allowed to speak and, more importantly, be heard. When you let yourself grieve, you are not being dramatic. You are being truthful. When you sit with your pain instead of escaping it, you are not wallowing. You are healing. This is what many people misunderstand about you. They think you're detached, unbothered, constantly reinventing yourself because you can't sit still. But the truth is, you survive by shifting, by moving, by adapting. And while those are strengths, healing calls for something deeper, stillness. Stillness doesn't mean inactivity. It means being present enough to let the aches surface. To remember the version of you who once trusted fully, laughed deeply, loved wildly, and to mourn her as she feels far away. But in that mourning, something beautiful begins to happen. You remember she never left. She just went quiet, waiting for you to make space for her again. And this is where divine restoration meets you. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but in the quiet rooms of your soul where God says, "I have seen your tears. I have not forgotten." You see, Healing is not about going back to who you were before the pain. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be, now infused with the wisdom, compassion, and depth that only this journey could give you. This is also the gate where forgiveness begins, not just for others, but for yourself, for the ways you coped, for the emotions you suppressed, for the mistakes you made while trying to survive. You were doing the best you could with what you had at the time, and God honors that. Restoration, in its essence, is not a reset. It's a resurrection of hope, of peace, of the trust you thought you'd lost for good. You may start to feel lighter soon, not because all your problems have disappeared, but because you're no longer carrying them alone. You'll start to notice how music makes you feel again, how a certain scent brings back a forgotten smile, how your prayers, once hollow, now feel like home. These are signs, quiet, powerful signs that you've crossed into a new spiritual terrain. Gemini, the greatest gift of this gate is not emotional release. It's emotional reunion with yourself, with your creator, with the divine parts of you that were never broken, only hidden behind layers of survival. You are safe to feel again. You are safe to soften. You are safe to trust that your heart knows the way forward, just as much as your mind does. And when those two unite, intellect and intuition, thought and tenderness, you become unstoppable. The restoration has already begun. Gate 4. Gemini's soul is coming home, and it changes everything. Gemini, there's a moment in every great restoration when something inside you quietly whispers, I remember who I am. Not the version others needed you to be, not the persona you put on to survive the storm, but the core, radiant, fully awake soul that has waited patiently beneath all your layers for the right season to rise again. This is that season. Up until now, your life may have felt like a scattering of fragments, beautiful, sharp, unfinished pieces of an identity that never seemed to fully settle. You've adapted so often that you started to believe adaptation was your essence. But Gemini, while your duality gives you range, it does not mean you are fragmented. It means you are whole in motion. And now, you are being called back to a wholeness that no longer requires performance or protection. The divine is returning something to you. Not an old dream, not a lost relationship, but your essential self. There's a phrase I often whisper to clients who are waking up from years of spiritual disconnection. Your soul was never lost, only displaced. And for you, Gemini, this rings especially true. Because somewhere in the chaos of becoming everything for everyone, you forgot what it felt like to simply be. Let me introduce you to Naomi, a Gemini in her 20s. She had always been the clever one, the friend who knew what to say, the student who aced exams without seeming to try, the daughter who wore 10 different masks depending on who was in the room. But behind all of this shimmer was silence, a silence that came not from peace, but from suppression. She didn't know what her actual voice sounded like anymore. Not the sarcastic one she used to deflect pain, not the smart one that helped her avoid vulnerability, but the true one, the one that didn't try to impress or defend. One day, in a moment of exhaustion, Naomi found herself sitting alone in a park, weeping quietly, overwhelmed not by one tragedy, but by the slow erosion of her authenticity. She had disappeared into the person others needed her to be, and yet something sacred happened that day. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and for the first time in years said out loud, I miss me. That prayer, because that's what it was, opened the door to her restoration. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. She began journaling again, not for social media posts, but for herself. She began choosing truth over charm in conversations. And eventually, she began creating from a place that felt like home within. Gemini, your journey mirrors hers in more ways than you realize. Your restoration isn't just about receiving back what was taken. It's about remembering that you were never really lost. You simply abandoned parts of yourself for the sake of survival, for harmony, for love. But now, God is calling you back, not to who you were before the loss, but to who you truly are beyond it. This homecoming may feel strange at first, like returning to a house you haven't lived in for years. The furniture may feel unfamiliar. The echoes may sound distant, but don't let that unsettle you. The more time you spend with yourself, the more this internal space becomes sacred again. And as you begin to move from this place of wholeness, everything changes. Your relationships shift. Suddenly, shallow conversations feel unbearable. Your priorities shift. Rest becomes as sacred as productivity. Your intuition sharpens. You no longer need to overthink decisions because your soul speaks clearly again. And the most beautiful shift? You stop needing to prove anything. You stop chasing love that doesn't see you. You stop explaining your depth to those committed to misunderstanding it. You stop negotiating your boundaries just to avoid discomfort. Because once you remember your worth, your energy becomes sacred ground. Gemini, this is where the restoration deepens. Not in gifts from the outside, but in the reclamation of your divine identity. You begin to walk differently, speak differently, pray differently. You realize that the longing you carried for so long wasn't about someone or something else. It was the homesickness for yourself. And this version of you, the whole, present, powerful you, has a destiny fulfilled that cannot be lived from fragments. The divine is not simply patching you up. He is anointing the restored version of you to carry something forward into the world. Wisdom, compassion, joy, truth. And this gift is needed now more than ever. So as you step into this new frequency of self, pay attention to what begins to align. Doors open without explanation. People show up who feel like soul recognition. You begin to magnetize what matches your truth. You're no longer performing. You're no longer pretending. You're home. And from here, Gemini, the next gate begins to open. Gate 5. Gemini's restoration will heal others too. Gemini, what if I told you that your personal restoration was never just about you? What if every tear you cried, every piece of your heart that shattered, every sleepless night spent questioning your worth, was actually preparing you to become a vessel of healing for others? This may sound overwhelming at first. You might think, but I'm just now starting to feel whole again. I'm not ready to carry anyone else. But I want you to listen closely, not with your analytical mind, but with the deeper knowing of your spirit. You were never meant to carry the weight of the world. You were meant to reflect its light. And now that your light is returning, not the artificial shine you used to wear for approval, but the authentic glow that comes from having walked through fire, you are ready. Not because you're finished healing, but because you now understand what true healing feels like. You know the sound of silent grief. You recognize the smile that covers a scar. You can hear the tremble in a voice that says, "I'm fine," when you know they are not. You, Gemini, are becoming the kind of person who can sit in someone's darkness without needing to fix it, because you've learned that presence is often the greatest balm. You are being shaped into a living testament, not perfection, but of sacred endurance. Let me share with you the story of Maya, a Gemini who survived the betrayal of a best friend and the collapse of a business she poured her soul into. For years, she told herself it was just bad timing, or that she wasn't cut out for deep connection. She threw herself into new ventures, new cities, new roles. Reinvention became her armor, but inside, she was grieving the death of trust. After a long sabbatical, Maya began writing anonymously on an online forum, sharing insights not as advice, but as stories. She wrote about her journey, about the moment she realized forgiveness wasn't for the other person, but for herself. She wrote about the days she stopped expecting apologies and started giving herself peace. Her words were raw, vulnerable, and filled with quiet power. And something miraculous happened. Strangers began writing back. "I thought I was the only one. You put my feelings into words. Because of you, I'm finally ready to let go." Maya hadn't set out to become anyone's healer. She simply shared her truth. But in doing so, she created a ripple, one that softened the hearts of others and gave them the courage to begin again. Gemini, this is what God is preparing through you. The restoration you're receiving is deeply personal, but it's also profoundly communal. As you regain your voice, someone else will find theirs. As you reclaim your trust, someone else will start to believe again. As you walk in your truth, someone watching will whisper, "If they can heal, maybe I can too." This is a divine mathematics of restoration. Nothing is wasted. Every loss you endured, every scar you carry, every lesson that bruised you before it blessed you, all of it becomes a sacred offering. You don't need to be a teacher, a counselor, or a spiritual guide to carry this energy. You just need to be real, because your authenticity will give others permission to stop pretending. Your wholeness will make others feel safe enough to explore their own brokenness, and your peace will quietly invite others into their own transformation. You are not here to fix people, Gemini. You are here to radiate what is possible, and this becomes a feedback loop. As you offer healing energy to others, your own restoration deepens. You begin to understand that love is not a transaction. It's a frequency, and you are now vibrating at the level of restoration. You may begin to notice synchronicities in your life. Being in the right place at the right time to offer a word, a look, a gesture that shifts someone's entire day. You may be asked to share your story in ways that surprise you. Or perhaps you'll simply feel a growing sense of alignment, that everything, finally, is beginning to make sense. But the beauty of this gate is that it asks for no performance. You don't need to posture or preach. All you need to do is be yourself, the version of yourself that has emerged from the ashes, the one who carries scars with grace, who has learned to speak kindly to their own reflection, who knows that love is not a prize to be won, but a light to be shared. And as you live from this place, Gemini, you become a lighthouse, quiet, constant, and impossible to ignore. So I ask you, what will you do with this healing? Not out of pressure, but from reverence. How will you let your story echo in the hearts of others? How will you remind the weary that joy is still possible? You don't need a stage. Your life is a stage. Your words are already prayers. Your resilience is already prophecy. And your restoration, it is already rippling outward in ways you may never fully see. But heaven sees, the divine sees, and every step you take in authenticity lights a path for someone else who's still searching in the dark. This Gemini is a true miracle of restoration. It begins with you, but it never ends there. Conclusion: Gemini, your restoration has already begun. Gemini, take a moment right now and place a hand over your heart. Can you feel it? The quiet shift, the warmth that has been building, not from something external, but from within you? You are no longer who you were when you began this journey. Something sacred has awakened, something ancient, something true, a deeper remembrance of who you are beneath the stories, the masks, the coping, the cleverness. This is not simply about recovering something lost. This is about returning to your divine design. You are a soul born of light and air, meant to move freely, to express openly, to love wildly. And yet life, with its inevitable grief and confusion, asked you to slow down, to be still, to confront the silence. That was not punishment. It was preparation. Because restoration is not a reversal. It is a revelation. You now carry wisdom in your eyes, grace in your voice, and courage in your every step. You have faced your own shadow and chosen to keep your heart open. And that, dear Gemini, is the most radical kind of faith there is. There may still be days when you feel uncertain. That's okay. Restoration is not a one-time miracle. It is a rhythm. It will keep unfolding gently and consistently, layer by layer. There is no rush. Trust the process. Trust the timing. Trust that God, who saw every moment of your suffering, is orchestrating every detail of your return to joy. And remember this, you are not just being restored for yourself. Your life is becoming a mirror for others to see what is possible. You are becoming the evidence that hope is real, that healing is holy, and that heaven still writes the final chapter. So, Gemini, if your spirit stirred during these words, if you felt seen, softened, or sparked, that is your confirmation. The restoration you've longed for is not just coming. It's already begun. And it will be more beautiful, more complete, and more abundant than you dare to imagine. I invite you now, gently, vulnerably, to leave a comment below. Share what part of your life you believe God is restoring. Your words may become the encouragement someone else desperately needs. And if this message found you in a moment of longing, I welcome you to subscribe and stay connected to our circle of healing and light. Because this isn't the end of your story, Gemini. It's the beginning of your becoming.